The hot wind of the Arizona territory spoke a language older than men. It whispered through the canyons and scoured the red earth, carrying the scent of sagebrush and the fine, gritty dust that settled into every crease of a man's soul. Ashki Nez, called Ash by the white men who could not trouble themselves with the shape of his full name, stood on a rise overlooking the scattered hogans of his people. The wind was a familiar companion, its touch on his cheek a reminder of where he belonged. He was a man of the din, the people, and his stillness was that of the land itself, watchful, patient, and containing a strength that fools often mistook for simplicity. A rider, a boy barely old enough to be called a man, urged a tired pony up the slope. His face was slick with sweat and powdered with the ubiquitous red dust. He slid from the horse before it had fully stopped, his words tumbling out in a rush of Navajo, painting a picture of chaos and violence on the San Miguel Trail. A supply wagon train, the one bringing flour and salt and medicine in trade, had been hit. Men were hurt, maybe worse. The attackers had come like ghosts out of the rock formations and vanished just as quickly. Ash listened without interruption, his dark eyes fixed on the horizon as if he could see the memory of the attack playing out against the vast, indifferent blue sky. His duty was clear. He was a tracker, a guardian. He had walked the path of the warrior, and now he taught the younger men how to read the earth, how to see the stories left behind in a broken twig or a displaced stone. He also guided the wagons for the traders, a foot in the world of the whites, a world that needed his skills but offered little more than coin and suspicion in return. It was a difficult balance, a path walked on the sharp edge of a knife. He gave a slight nod to the boy, a gesture of dismissal and understanding, and turned back toward his family's hogan. The time for watching was over. Hundreds of miles east, in a stuffy rail car that smelled of coal smoke and stale air, Evelyn Hart tried to capture the world outside in her journal. The words felt small and inadequate. "Kansas is a place of soft edges," she wrote, the pencil point scratching against the paper. "The green hills roll into one another like sleeping giants. Here, everything is sharp. The land does not forgive. It is all angles and thorns, a beauty so fierce it frightens me." She looked out the window at a landscape that seemed baked by a relentless sun. Saguaro cacti stood like silent sentinels, their arms raised in a permanent state of surrender or warning. She could not decide which. She had seen a cholla cactus earlier, its fuzzy appearance belying the vicious spines that clung to anything that brushed against it. A perfect metaphor for this place, she thought. It offered an illusion of softness, but its touch was pain. She was coming to marry Marshall Thomas Vail, a man she knew mostly through letters filled with confident prose about bringing order to a lawless frontier. He was a figure of great importance in San Miguel, a town she imagined as a nascent beacon of civilization. Her part in this grand project was to be a teacher. She carried books in her trunk filled with Shakespeare and Emerson, tools to build a schoolhouse of the mind for children who knew only dust and hardship. She dreamed of teaching all the children, the ones from the town and those from the surrounding lands, the Mexican children and the Navajo. It was a noble, clean ideal, born in the parlors of Topeka, and it was the only thing that quieted the tremor of uncertainty in her heart. Thomas was a good man, a strong man, but his letters spoke of taming the land. While she felt a growing desire to understand it, Ash gathered two other men, young hunters with keen eyes and the quiet discipline he had instilled in them. They carried little water skins, jerky, a handful of dried corn, and the weapons they knew as extensions of their own hands. They moved with a fluid grace, their moccasins making no sound on the hard-packed earth. As they rode out, Ash felt the familiar pull of two worlds. Behind him was the world of his people, of family, of traditions that stretched back to the beginning of time. Ahead lay San Miguel, a place of wooden sidewalks and false fronts, a town that would pay him for his service and then look through him as if he were part of the landscape, as featureless and nameless as a rock or a scrub bush. The town of San Miguel baked in the afternoon sun, a collection of clapboard and adobe buildings huddled together as if for protection. Dust devils danced down the main street, and the air was thick with the smells of horse manure, cheap whiskey, and frying bacon. Marshal Thomas Vale stood on the porch of his office, a solid, handsome man whose silver star gleamed on his vest. He projected an aura of unshakable authority. He spoke to a small gathering of anxious merchants, his voice calm and reassuring. He told them a posse was being formed. He told them order would be restored. He promised justice. When one of the men mentioned that the Navajo tracker, Ashki Nez, was already on the trail, the marshal's jaw tightened for a fraction of a second. His skills are useful, Vale conceded, his tone making it clear he considered it a temporary and distasteful alliance. He will find their trail for us. Then, proper lawmen will see to the rest. To Thomas Vale, Ash was a tool, a hunting dog to be pointed in the right direction. Once the quarry was found, the dog would be chained up again. Its purpose served. He saw the world in clear lines, civilization and savagery, law and chaos. There was no room for the gray spaces in between, the spaces where men like Ash lived. Evelyn arrived on a stagecoach that afternoon, covered in a fine layer of dust that felt like a second skin. Thomas greeted her with a proprietary kiss, his hand firm on her elbow as he guided her through the street. "It is rougher than you imagined. I expect," he said, not as a question but as a statement. "But we will make a fine life here. You will see." She saw the hard faces of the miners and the weary expressions of the women. She saw a group of Navajo standing silently outside the mercantile, their colorful blankets a stark contrast to the drab browns of the town. And she saw how the white townsfolk gave them a wide berth, their expressions a mixture of fear and contempt. In a corner of the general store, she overheard two men talking in low, angry voices about the copper vultures, a gang of outlaws led by a man named Rafe Greeley. They spoke his name as if it were a curse. Greeley and his men were a plague, preying on travelers and homesteaders, their greed as vast and empty as the desert itself. Evelyn felt a chill despite the oppressive heat. The clean lines of her idealism were already beginning to blur, smudged by the grime and complexity of this new reality. Miles away, Ash knelt beside the plundered wagon. The scene was one of violent haste. Sacks of flour had been slashed open, their contents spilled across the ground like a pale wound. A crate of tinned goods was splintered, its contents looted. The freighters had been left wounded but alive, a message of dominance from the attackers. The copper vultures did not always kill, not when fear could do their work for them. Ash's eyes scanned the ground, missing nothing. He saw the tracks of a dozen shod horses, driven hard, but he saw something else, too. A set of prints moving in the opposite direction. A horse deliberately walked away from the scene before the main attack. It was a detail a posse would miss. It was the mark of a planner, a strategist. This was not random violence. It was organized. As he rose, his gaze fell on something half buried in the flour-dusted dirt. It was a small, leather-bound book. He picked it up, his calloused fingers gentle on the cover. He could not read the words inside, but he recognized it as an object of learning, of a world far from this sun-blasted patch of earth. It felt delicate, out of place, a whisper of another life. He tucked it carefully into his saddlebag, an unaccountable feeling of protectiveness settling over him. As the sun bled across the western sky, painting the clouds in hues of orange and violet, Ash and his men made a cold camp. He sat apart from the others, watching the stars begin to prick the darkening canopy. He thought of the ambush, of the strange tracks leading away, and of the small book in his bag. The trail of the copper vultures led toward San Miguel. It led toward the world of the marshal and his promised bride from the east. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of distant rain and the endless ancient whisper of the land. It spoke of debts and reckonings, of paths that were destined to cross. Ash closed his eyes and listened, knowing that the journey ahead would demand a price, paid not in coin, but in something far more valuable. The red dust of the territory held the memories of every struggle, every injustice, and it was blowing toward them all. San Miguel attempted a festival. Lanterns, strung between the general store and the saloon, cast a soft, yellow glow that fought a losing battle against the immense darkness of the surrounding territory. A fiddler sawed away at a cheerful tune, and the sound, thin and hopeful, drifted into the night. It was a gathering meant to welcome the remnants of the supply train and to pretend, for a few hours, that this small outpost of civilization was not an island in a vast and unforgiving sea. Evelyn Hart stood beside Thomas Vale, a polite smile fixed on her face. She felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if she were watching the scene through a pane of dusty glass. Thomas was in his element, accepting congratulations for the safe, albeit diminished, arrival of the wagons. He clapped men on the back and spoke of rebuilding and resilience. He was a pillar of confidence. Once the new supply depot is built and the vultures are dealt with, we will set a date, he said to her, his voice a low, proprietary murmur. A proper wedding. You will have the first respectable house in this town. Evelyn looked past him, her gaze falling on a small group of families, Mexican and Dine, who lingered at the edge of the light, their children watching the festivities with wide, solemn eyes. They were not part of the celebration. They were merely spectators at the border of a world that did not include them. Before that, Thomas, she began, her voice quiet but firm. I would like to start the school. For all the children, those little ones over there have as much right to learn to read as the banker's son. Thomas followed her gaze, and a flicker of impatience crossed his handsome features. Evelyn, we have spoken of this. There is a time and a place for such charity. First, we must establish order. We must make the town secure. These things must be done in the proper sequence. I do not see it as charity, she countered, the polite smile now gone. I see it as a necessity. How can a community be whole if most of its people are kept in ignorance? They have their own ways, he said dismissively, his tone closing the subject. Now, come. You must meet Judge Hemlock. He is a man of great influence. He placed his hand on the small of her back, a gesture that was meant to be reassuring but felt like he was steering an errant piece of livestock. The distance between them, she realized, was not measured in miles, but in the vast, unbridgeable canyon of their understanding. It was then that three riders emerged from the darkness at the end of the street. They did not ride into the lantern light, but stopped just beyond its reach, becoming silent, imposing silhouettes. The fiddle music faltered and died. Conversations dwindled to nervous whispers. The townsfolk turned, a collective tension rippling through them. It was Ashkianez and his two companions. Ash dismounted, his movements economical and deliberate. He walked into the light, his gaze sweeping over the crowd before settling on the man with the silver star. He stopped a respectful distance from the marshal, his face an unreadable mask. The trail leads back here. Marshal, Ash said, his voice low and even, yet it carried in the sudden silence. The men who hit the wagon were professionals. They knew the terrain, but there was something else. A single rider left the scene before the attack, moving slow, deliberate. The trail was meant to look like a simple raid. Vale crossed his arms over his chest, his expression one of weary condescension. And what is that supposed to mean? Nez, some kind of Indian riddle? It means it was a message, Ash replied, ignoring the insult. And a diversion. They were not just taking goods. They were making a statement. The only statement I am interested in is the one I will make when I have Rafe Greeley and his scum in irons, Vale declared loudly. Playing to the crowd, he turned his back on Ash. A clear dismissal. Thank you for your service. The town will see you are paid. Evelyn watched the exchange, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. She saw the quiet dignity in the Navajo man's bearing, the intelligence in his steady gaze. And she saw the marshal's casual arrogance, his refusal to hear anything that did not fit his simple narrative of good versus evil. The first gunshot shattered the night. It was followed by a volley. Glass exploded from the windows of the mercantile. Women screamed. The crowd, moments before a picture of fragile community, dissolved into a panicked mob. Men in dusty coats, their faces obscured by bandanas, were swarming the supply depot, firing their pistols into the air. The copper vultures had come to town. From the other end of the street, an orange glow blossomed against the night sky. Shouts of fire went up. The livery stable was burning, the terrified whinnies of trapped horses cutting through the chaos. The attack was a two-pronged assault, designed to split the town's defenders and maximize confusion. Thomas Vale reacted instantly, his voice a bellow of command. He organized a line to fight the fire and deputized a handful of men to return fire on the vultures. He was brave, decisive, and completely overwhelmed. In the turmoil, Evelyn was shoved against a water trough. She saw Thomas, a pistol in his hand, directing men toward the stable, his face grim in the flickering firelight. He was a lawman, and his first duty was to the town, to property, to order. She was a part of that order, but in that moment, she was on her own. A rough hand grabbed her arm. A coarse voice snarled in her ear. "The marshal's lady. You'll be our insurance." She was dragged away from the light, her cry lost in the cacophony of gunfire and flames. The morning sun rose on a scene of devastation. The livery stable was a smoldering ruin. The supply depot was looted, its doors splintered and its shelves bare. Several men were wounded, and a heavy pall of smoke and despair hung over San Miguel. Marshal Thomas Vale, his face smudged with soot and exhaustion, began the work of restoring order. It was nearly an hour before the true cost of the night became clear. Evelyn Hart was gone. A frantic search began. Vale, his face a mask of cold fury, led the effort. They found the first sign near the alley behind the hotel where she was staying. A single, elegant lady's boot print, pressed deep into the mud where a water barrel had overturned. The heel dug in as if she had tried to resist. A few yards farther on, caught on the splintered corner of a fence post, was a scrap of blue ribbon she had worn in her hair. The trail led them out of the town, toward the thin line of cottonwoods that marked the banks of the little Colorado River. There, in the soft, damp earth, they found the final, horrifying proof. The ground was scuffed and torn, and leading away from the struggle, heading into the desolate wilderness, were the unmistakable marks of a body being dragged. The town council convened an emergency meeting in the marshal's office. They were frightened men, their livelihoods threatened and their sense of security shattered. They officially hired Thomas Vale to hunt down the copper vultures and rescue his intended. They gave him funds to raise a posse, their words a mixture of outrage and grim determination. "Bring her back, Marshal," the mayor said, his voice trembling. "And bring us the head of Rafe Greeley." Vale accepted the charge, his voice ringing with conviction. He promised swift, brutal justice. He would lead the posse himself, and they would not return until his fiancée was safe and her captors were either dead or in chains. While the town buzzed with the righteous fury of men preparing for a manhunt, Ashki Nez walked the riverbank alone. He had seen the tracks the posse had found, the obvious signs of a struggle and an abduction. But his eyes saw more. He moved downstream, away from the scene, his gaze fixed on the ground. And there it was, faint but clear to a man who knew how to look, the print of a shod horse. The shoe had been put on backward. It was an old trick, one used to make a trail appear to be going in the opposite direction. It was a trick favored by cunning men who knew that most trackers look for the obvious. It was a signature. Ash had seen it once before, years ago, after a stagecoach robbery that had left the lawmen chasing their own tails for a week. It was the work of Rafe Greeley. Ash straightened up, his eyes scanning the far bank. The abduction was a performance, just like the attack on the wagon train. It was a piece of theater designed to send the marshal and his posse on a wild goose chase south, following a false trail, while the real trail led elsewhere. They had not just taken the marshal's bride, they had taken her to control the marshal himself, to lead him by his pride and his heart into a trap or an ambush. He walked back toward town, the weight of his knowledge a heavy burden. He knew the truth, a truth that was etched into the earth for anyone with the wisdom to read it. But he also knew that in San Miguel, the word of a Navajo tracker meant less than the dust kicked up by the marshal's boots. The law was preparing to ride in the wrong direction, fueled by grief and prejudice. True justice, Ash understood, had to follow the real trail, even if it meant walking it alone. The air in San Miguel was thick with the grit of impending violence. Men with rifles checked their ammunition, their faces set in grim lines, ready to ride south on a trail of righteous fury. Marshal Thomas Vale stood at the head of the newly formed posse, his horse a fine, powerful roan, his hand resting confidently on the butt of his pistol. He was the very picture of frontier justice, about to lead his men into the wilderness to hunt down the savages who had stolen his future wife. Ashki Nez and his two companions approached on foot, their movements a silent counterpoint to the nervous energy of the armed men. They stopped before Vale, and the posse quieted, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. "You are riding the wrong way, Marshal," Ash said. He did not raise his voice, but the words cut through the morning air with the clarity of a striking bell. Vale's eyes narrowed. "I will thank you not to tell me how to do my job. Nez, the trail is clear. We found where they dragged her." "You found what they wanted you to find," Ash corrected him. "The real trail is hidden, a horse with a backward shoe. It leads north, not south. While you chase a ghost trail into the desert, Rafe Greeley takes her deeper into the canyons." A murmur of disbelief and scorn went through the posse. One of the men, a burly blacksmith, spat into the dust. "It is a trick. The Indian is trying to lead us astray." Vale looked from the blacksmith's angry face to Ash's calm one. For a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his features. He was a proud man, but not a stupid one. "Show me." Ash led him to the riverbank, away from the trampling boots of the others. He pointed with his chin, not his finger. "There, under the lip of the bank, the print is almost washed away, but you can see the curve of the shoe is wrong. The caulk marks are at the toe, not the heel." He walked the horse this way to lay the false trail, then turned and rode north, staying in the shallows for half a mile to hide his tracks. Vale stared at the faint impression in the mud. It was undeniable. A cold fury, different from his public anger, settled over him. He had been made a fool of. North, he said, the word a curse, into the broken lands. "They have a 2-day start," Ash said. "Your posse is heavy. You will not catch them by following their path. But there is a way to get ahead of them. A hard way." "Then speak it," Vale snapped, his patience gone. "We cut through Deneta, through the land of my people. The trails are known only to us. They are steep and dangerous, but they will put us across Greeley's path in 3 days. Your way, you will be lucky to see their dust in a week." The thought was abhorrent to Vale and the men with him. To ask for passage, to place their lives and their mission in the hands of the very people they so often disdained, was a bitter pill to swallow. The marshal's jaw worked silently. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to rely on his own authority and the strength of his own men. But then, the image of Evelyn, alone and in the hands of brutes like Greeley, rose in his mind. The urgency was a physical pain. Time was the one thing he could not afford to waste. "We ride with you," Vale said, his voice clipped and strained. "But make no mistake, Nez, if this is a trick, if you lead us into an ambush, I will see you hang from the highest cottonwood I can find." Ash simply nodded and turned away, his expression unchanged. The threats of white men were as common and as meaningless as the wind. The trail was the only thing that mattered. The journey was a descent into a harsher world. The land grew angular and hostile, a place of sun-baked rock and thorny vegetation. The men of the posse, accustomed to the flatter trails around San Miguel, grumbled as their horses struggled on the treacherous inclines. They rode in a tense, unhappy silence, the white men in a tight, defensive bunch, with Ash and his two companions scouting far ahead, moving with an ease that only deepened the posse's resentment. Late on the second day, Ash led them to a solitary hogan nestled in a small, sheltered cove, protected from the wind by a sweep of red rock. Smoke curled from the hole in its roof, a thin, gray ribbon against the enormous sky. An older woman, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, emerged as they approached. She moved with the slow, deliberate grace of age and wisdom. "Adani," Ash said, his voice softer than Vale had ever heard it. He spoke to her in their own language, words that flowed like water over stones. She was his mother's cousin, a widow who lived alone, herding a small flock of sheep. She listened to Ash, her dark, intelligent eyes moving from his face to the grim, dust-caked men behind him. Then, without a word, she turned and went back inside her home. She returned with a water gourd, a bowl of mutton stew, and a small pot of a greasy, fragrant salve made from juniper and pinon sap. She offered the water first to Ash, then to the others. Some of the posse members hesitated, their prejudice warring with their thirst, but the heat was a merciless master, and soon they were all drinking deeply. She ladled out the stew, a simple, nourishing meal that quieted their stomachs and their complaints. She offered the salve for their sunburned faces and cracked lips. Her hospitality was a silent, powerful thing, offered without question or expectation of thanks. As Ash spoke quietly with her, Vale heard her say something that sounded like a lament. He watched Ash's face grow still, his gaze distant. Later, when they were preparing to leave, Vale's curiosity got the better of him. "What did the old woman say to you?" Ash looked at him, his eyes holding a weariness that had nothing to do with the trail. "She spoke of the fatigue that comes from guarding the maps for other men, men who do not know the land and do not care to, who only wish to cross it to get to the other side." The words were a plain statement of fact, but they landed on Vale with the weight of an accusation. They had not been riding for an hour when the sky began to change. The brilliant blue leached away, replaced by a sickly, brownish yellow. The wind, which had been a constant, hot breath, began to rise, coming in violent, dust-filled gusts. "We need to find shelter," Ash said, pulling his horse to a halt. "A big storm is coming." "It is just wind," one of the posse men scoffed, wiping grit from his eyes. "We need to keep moving." "That is no wind," Ash countered, his voice flat. "That is the land rising up to swallow us. We find cover now, or we will be buried in it." Before Vale could make a decision, the world disappeared. A solid wall of sand and dust hit them with the force of a physical blow. The sun vanished. The air became a roaring, suffocating torrent of grit. Visibility dropped to the length of a man's arm. Horses whinnied in terror, turning in blind circles. Men shouted, their voices instantly snatched away by the gale. Vale was blinded, disoriented. He could feel his horse panicking beneath him, threatening to bolt into the maelstrom. He pulled hard on the reins, but it was like trying to hold back the tide. He was lost. The chilling realization that he could die here, choked and sightless, within a few hundred yards of his men, seized him. This was a power he could not face down with a gun and a star. Suddenly, a firm hand gripped his horse's bridle. Through the swirling chaos, he saw the dark, calm shape of Ashki Nez. Ash leaned close, his mouth next to Vale's ear. "This way, there is a rock ledge." Ash did not wait for an answer. He pulled Vale's horse along, his own mount sure-footed and steady. He moved with an unnerving confidence, as if he could see through the storm. He led them into the lee of a massive sandstone outcropping. where the force of the wind was lessened, one by one. The other men, lost and terrified, stumbled into the small pocket of relative calm. Drawn by Ash's shouts, they huddled together, horses and men, as the world howled and raged around them for what felt like an eternity. When the storm finally passed, it was as if a curtain had been lifted. The wind dropped to a whisper, and a profound silence fell over the land. The sun reappeared, casting long shadows across a landscape that had been scoured and reshaped. Vale looked at Ash, who was calmly checking his horse. The Navajo tracker had not just saved him. He had saved all of them. He had done it without fuss or drama, with a competence that was as natural to him as breathing. Vale felt a stab of something he refused to name. It was a grudging, resentful respect. He said nothing. No thanks were offered. None were expected. Ash found the trail again in a landscape scrubbed clean. The tracks were faint, but the storm had also preserved them in places, covering them with a fine layer of sand. He led them to a small box canyon where Greeley's men had clearly taken shelter. The remains of a small fire were there, and the ground was littered with tracks. As Ash circled the dead fire, his eyes caught a flash of color tucked into the gnarled roots of an old juniper tree. He knelt and gently worked it free. It was a lady's scarf, made of a fine crimson silk, shockingly bright against the dun-colored earth. It was stained with soot and smelled faintly of wood smoke, but there was another scent clinging to the fabric, a sharp, medicinal smell of crushed sage and another herb he recognized as one the Daine used to clean wounds. He stood up, holding the delicate piece of cloth in his hand. This was not the token of a helpless victim. This was a sign. Evelyn Hart had been near their fire. She had likely used the heat to warm a poultice of herbs she had gathered herself. Perhaps she had freed her hands, if only for a short time. She was fighting. She was surviving. A strange, protective feeling washed over him, fierce and unexpected. He felt a connection to this unknown woman, this teacher from Kansas with her books and her ideals. He admired her spirit, a spirit that refused to be broken by this harsh land or the brutal men who held her. He looked at the soft silk, a piece of her life, of her world. Then he remembered she was the marshal's intended. He quickly smoothed all expression from his face, turning his inner turmoil into a mask of stone. He walked over to Thomas Vale and held out the scarf. "She is alive," he said, "and she is smart." Vale snatched the scarf from his hand, his knuckles white. He saw only a possession that had been sullied. His face was a thundercloud of possessive rage. "When I find Greeley," he growled, "I will kill him with my bare hands." Ash watched him, a quiet understanding dawning in his heart. The marshal was not hunting to save a woman. He was hunting to reclaim his property and avenge his pride. A rare, cool drop of water struck Ash's cheek. He looked up. A single, dark cloud was passing overhead, shedding a sparse, almost miraculous rain. The drops hissed in the dust, leaving small, dark circles that were gone as quickly as they appeared. It was not enough to wash the land, but for a fleeting moment, it felt like a promise, a fragile glimmer of hope on a long and desperate trail. The trail led them north, deeper into a maze of canyons and mesas that seemed designed by a malevolent god to confound and discourage. By the third day, they came upon an abandoned ranch, a testament to some homesteader's failed dream. The cabin sagged, its spine broken. The corral fence had collapsed, and the well was a dry, dark hole that seemed to exhale a breath of dust and regret. It was a place of ghosts. The posse dismounted, the men grateful for the rest. But Ashki Nez's work was just beginning. While Vale and his men checked the cabin for any sign of their quarry, Ash circled the perimeter, his eyes reading the ground. Greeley's men had been here, and recently, they had stopped to rest their horses and finish the last of their stolen supplies. He could see where they had picketed their animals, the ground churned by a dozen nervous hooves. But as he examined the ashes of their campfire, he saw something else. Partially buried under a layer of wind-blown sand near the fire pit was a small, leather-bound ledger. Its corners charred. Most of it had been consumed by the flames. But a few pages remained, protected by the dampness of the earth. He carefully extracted it. The pages were filled with columns of figures and lists of supplies. Flour, beans, coffee, yes, but also other things, boxes of rifle cartridges, of a specific caliber, fuses, and several crates of dynamite. His eyes scanned the names listed next to the transactions. Most were unfamiliar, but one name made him pause. It was the name of the merchant who ran the main supply depot in San Miguel, a man who sat on the town council. This was no simple list of stolen goods. This was a record of business dealings, a shadow contract written in pencil and ash. Greeley was not just a raider. He was a partner. The attacks, the chaos, they served a purpose beyond simple theft. They created fear, drove down land prices, and created a need for the kind of iron-fisted order that ambitious men could use to seize power. Men like the merchant, and perhaps men like the marshal. Ash carefully tore the remaining page from the book's spine, folded it, and tucked it deep inside his shirt. He said nothing. The knowledge was a cold weight against his skin. Evelyn felt the rough texture of the ropes against her wrists. They had been tied for days, and the skin was raw. She had been forced to ride with her hands bound to the saddle horn, a humiliating and agonizing posture. Her captors were coarse, brutal men who spoke little and laughed less. The one named Greeley was their leader, a man with cold, calculating eyes who seemed to be nursing a deep and bitter grudge against the world. He treated her not as a person, but as a chess piece, a valuable asset in a game she did not understand. That night, they made camp in a narrow wash, the high rock walls providing some shelter from the wind. After a meager meal of hardtack and jerky, she was tied to a small, gnarled scrub oak. But the man who tied the knots was careless, his mind dulled by whiskey from a flask he passed around. He left a fraction of an inch of slack in the rope. For hours, long after the men had fallen into a drunken sleep, Evelyn worked. She twisted her wrists, pulling and pushing, her raw skin screaming in protest. The fibers of the rope bit deeper, but slowly, painstakingly. The knot began to give. Her fingers, numb and clumsy, fumbled with the loop, and then it was loose. She held her breath, listening to the snores of the sleeping men, and slipped her hands free. Freedom was a terrifying thing. The darkness was absolute, filled with the unseen rustlings of night creatures. She crept away from the fire, her stockinged feet making no sound on the sandy ground. A thin stream of water trickled nearby, and she followed its sound, hoping it would lead her away. She stumbled into a thicket of reeds, their dry stalks whispering around her as she pushed through. She was a ghost in the darkness, a creature of pure, desperate will. She did not see the cholla cactus until it was too late. She brushed against it, and a dozen barbed segments detached, embedding themselves in her forearm. A cry of agony escaped her lips, and she bit down hard on her tongue to stifle it. The pain was blinding, a white-hot fire that radiated up her arm. She tried to pull the segments free, but the spines were like fish hooks, digging deeper with every movement. The cry, small as it was, had been enough. Behind her, a man shouted. A lantern was lit, its beam cutting through the darkness. She tried to run, but her legs were clumsy with exhaustion and pain. They caught her at the edge of the wash, their rough hands grabbing her, their voices thick with anger. Greeley came forward, his face a mask of cold fury in the lantern light. He looked at her arm, bristling with spines, then at her face, streaked with tears of pain and frustration. He did not offer comfort. He simply retied her ropes, this time with a cruel efficiency that left no hope of escape. She had shown them she had fight, and they would make sure she never had the chance again. Back on the trail, the tension in the posse was a palpable thing. Vale's frustration grew with every passing mile. The trail was getting colder, and his authority was being steadily undermined by his reliance on the silent Navajo tracker. They came to a fork in the canyon, a place where a rock slide had created two possible paths. Ash dismounted and studied the ground. They went left, he said after a moment. The path is harder, but it will hide their tracks better. The right path is more direct, Vale countered, his voice sharp with impatience. It follows the old miner's trail. It makes more sense. They are not trying to be direct, Ash explained calmly. They are trying to disappear. They know they are being followed. The left trail offers more cover. I am the law here, Nez, Vale said, his hand dropping to his pistol. And I say we go right. We are wasting time. You will be wasting more than time if you ride into an ambush, Ash said, his voice remaining level, but with an edge of steel. That is what a man who wants to get away would want you to think. He would make the obvious trail a trap. The challenge to his authority, delivered so quietly and in front of his men, was more than Vale could stomach. The marshal's carefully constructed composure finally shattered. With a snarl of rage, he drew his pistol. He did not aim to kill, but to dominate. He fired a shot into the ground, a few feet from where Ash stood. The explosion was deafening in the confines of the canyon, the sound echoing off the rock walls like a clap of thunder. Dust and pebbles sprayed into the air. The posse's horses shied and whinnied in terror. The men looked on, their faces a mixture of shock and fear. The gunshot had not only been an act of aggression against Ash, it had been an act of supreme recklessness. If Greeley's men were anywhere within a mile, their position was now compromised. Ash did not flinch. He did not move. He simply looked at Vale, his dark eyes filled with a profound and weary contempt. In that moment, he saw the marshal for what he was, a man so consumed by his own pride that he would risk everything, including the life of the woman he claimed to love, to maintain the illusion of his own power. The law, in Vale's hands, was not a shield for the innocent. It was a club to be wielded by the powerful. Vale, realizing his mistake, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment, quickly holstered his pistol. We go right, he said, his voice a low growl, daring anyone to contradict him. He spurred his horse forward, leading the shaken posse down the wider, more obvious trail. That night, Ash sat apart from the others, the silence between him and the rest of the camp a chasm that could not be crossed. He watched the firelight flicker on the faces of the posse members, men who had placed their trust in a leader who was both blind and dangerous. He felt the folded piece of ledger against his chest. He now understood that Evelyn Hart was not just a captive. She was a pawn in a much larger, dirtier game. To follow Vale was to walk into a trap, not of Greeley's making, but of the marshal's own pride and corruption. His duty to the town of San Miguel was a contract, a thing of coin and convenience, but his duty to the woman who fought back against her captors, the woman who used sage to treat her wounds and whose scarf he still carried. That was something else. It was a matter of conscience. The law had failed. It was time for justice to find its own path. Long after the last of the posse had fallen asleep, Ash rose. He moved with the silence of an owl's flight, gathering his meager belongings. He did not look back at the sleeping camp. He was no longer their guide. He was a hunter, and he would hunt alone. He melted into the darkness of the canyon, his moccasins leaving no trace, his heart set on the trail that reason and instinct told him was true. He was a man walking away from the law and toward a more fundamental truth, a man choosing to stand with the wronged, even if it meant standing entirely alone. The left fork in the canyon was a difficult, brutal path. Ashki Nez moved along it with a patient, relentless rhythm, his body a part of the landscape, his eyes missing nothing. The trail was nearly invisible to an untrained eye, but for Ash, it was a story. A displaced pebble here, a bruised leaf there. He found a single, dark drop of blood on the flat surface of a gray stone, and a little farther on, a tiny blue thread, the color of a summer sky, snagged on the thorn of a mesquite branch. These were the whispers of the woman's passage, signs of her pain and her resilience. They pulled him forward, a silent, urgent summons. The scent of water came to him first, a cool, green smell that cut through the dry, dusty air of the canyon. Then he heard it, the low murmur of a river bending its way through the rock. It was a sound of life in a land of baked earth and stone. As he drew closer, another sound reached him, one that did not belong. It was the choked, desperate sound of a woman weeping. He moved with the silence of a shadow, slipping through a stand of tamarisk trees that grew thick along the bank. And then he saw her. She was kneeling at the water's edge, a figure of profound and wretched misery. Her dress was in tatters, shredded beyond any hope of modesty or repair. Her hair, once neatly pinned, was a wild tangle down her back. Her arms and face were scratched and bruised, and a raw, angry wound marred her forearm. She was trying to wash the cut, but her movements were weak, clumsy with exhaustion. As he watched, she swayed, her strength finally giving out, and slipped from the muddy bank into the cold, shallow water. The shock of the cold was the final indignity. A raw, heartbroken sob was torn from her, and she curled in on herself, weeping, shivering uncontrollably from the cold, the fear, and the utter desolation of her spirit. Ash stopped. The sight of her vulnerability was a physical blow. He stood for a long moment, a statue in the dappled light, and deliberately turned his face away, affording her the dignity the world had stolen. He unfastened the thick wool blanket from his shoulders, the one that served as his coat and his bed. He moved forward, his step soft on the riverside grass. "You are safe now," he said, his voice low and calm, so as not to startle her. Evelyn's head snapped up, her eyes wide with terror. She saw the tall, broad-shouldered figure of the Navajo man, his face averted, and she flinched, trying to cover herself with her torn clothing. Ash did not look at her. He simply extended his arm, the heavy blanket held out in his hand. "Take this. The water is cold." She hesitated for only a second. The deep, steady calm in his voice was a lifeline, shivering so hard her teeth chattered. She reached out and took the blanket. It was heavy and smelled of wood smoke and the clean scent of the desert. She wrapped it around her trembling body, the rough wool a comfort against her cold skin. Only then did Ash turn to face her, his gaze careful and impersonal, resting on the wound on her arm. He stepped into the shallow water, the cold seeping into his moccasins, and offered his hand. "Let me help you out." His touch was firm and respectful. He helped her to her feet and guided her to the dry bank, making sure the blanket stayed securely around her. He knelt before her without a word and examined her arm. The cholla spines were gone, but they had left a vicious, inflamed gash. "This needs to be cleaned and stitched," he said simply. He looked around. "There is a cabin nearby, an old place for the timber patrols. It will be shelter." She could only nod, too exhausted and overwhelmed to speak. He helped her to her feet, and with a steadying hand on her elbow, he led her away from the river that had been both her torment and her hope. The cabin was a small, rough-hewn box of logs, abandoned and filled with the dust of seasons, but it had 4 walls and a roof, and a stone hearth that promised warmth. Ash settled her on the floor near the fireplace, still wrapped in his blanket, and immediately set to work. He moved with a quiet efficiency that was profoundly reassuring. He gathered dry wood and, with a flint and steel, coaxed a small flame to life. As the fire grew, chasing the chill and the shadows from the small room, he took a small pot from his pack, filled it with river water, and set it on the edge of the hearth to boil. He found a handful of sage leaves in a small pouch and dropped them into the heating water, filling the cabin with a sharp, clean scent. When the water was hot, he poured some into a cup and brought it to her. "Drink this. It will help with the chill." The sage tea was bitter, but it was warm, and it spread through her body like a slow sunrise. Then he tended to her arm. He had a small leather roll that contained a needle, a length of sinew, and a clean piece of linen. He washed the gash with the boiled water, his touch gentle but firm, his focus absolute. Evelyn watched his hands, strong and sure. As he worked, she watched the concentration on his face, the way his dark eyes were fixed on his task. This was not the marshal, with his grand pronouncements and possessive gestures. This was a man of quiet, deliberate action. He was a man who saw what needed to be done and did it, without fanfare or expectation. He stitched the wound with small, neat stitches, his movements precise. She barely felt the bite of the needle. When he was done, he wrapped her arm in the clean linen. He met her eyes for the first time, a question in his gaze. "Is that too tight?" She shook her head, unable to find her voice. A tear she had not known was there slipped down her cheek. It was not a tear of pain or fear, but of profound, overwhelming gratitude. He said nothing, but he did not look away. The small cabin was an island of safety in a world that had become a nightmare. The fire crackled, a warm and living heart in the center of the room. The silence stretched between them, no longer empty, but filled with a new and powerful understanding. They were no longer a tracker and a lost bride. They were two people, stripped of all pretense by the harshness of the land, who had found a moment of grace in a forgotten cabin. Later, as the light outside began to fade, he offered her some jerky, which she ate slowly. The warmth of the fire had stopped her shivering, and the exhaustion that had held her for days was beginning to settle deep into her bones. She drew her knees to her chest, pulling the blanket tighter around her. He sat on the other side of the hearth, watching the flames. He seemed carved from the same patient stone as the mountains, his stillness a source of immense strength. She felt an overwhelming urge to close the small distance between them. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. He turned his head and simply nodded, accepting her gratitude as a plain fact, not something that required a response. Slowly, as if in a dream, she moved closer to the fire. To him? She leaned her head against his shoulder. He stiffened for a moment, surprised, and then relaxed, a silent acceptance of the gesture. She closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the feeling of being safe, truly safe. For the first time in days, his presence was a solid, unshakable wall against the chaos. He did not move. He simply let her rest there, his warmth seeping into her. After a long time, he gently shifted, and she lifted her head. Their faces were very close in the flickering firelight. She saw the weariness in his eyes, but she also saw a deep well of compassion. He looked at her not as the marshal's fiancée, not as a white woman to be rescued, but as a person, a survivor. He raised his hand and gently brushed the stray tear from her cheek with his thumb. The touch was electric, a spark in the quiet room. He leaned in, and his lips met hers. The kiss was slow, hesitant at first, then deepened. It was not a kiss of hungry passion, but of profound recognition, a silent acknowledgement of the impossible journey that had brought them to this single, incandescent moment. It was a promise of life in the face of death, of warmth in the face of the cold. He drew his blanket around them both, pulling her close against the vast, dark loneliness of the night, and the only sounds were the soft crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind in the pines. The morning light, when it came, was clear and soft, slanting through the dusty cabin window. Evelyn woke to the smell of coffee. Ash was tending the fire, his movements as quiet as they had been the night before. He handed her a cup of the strong, black liquid, and they sat in a comfortable silence, watching the new day begin. "I will take you back to San Miguel," he said finally, his voice neutral. "You will be safe there." Evelyn looked down at her bandaged arm, then up at his steady face. The thought of returning to San Miguel, to Thomas, filled her not with relief, but with a cold dread. The safety of this cabin, the simple, honest care this man had shown her, had washed away the last of her illusions. "No," she said, her voice clear and firm. "I will not go back to him." Ash's expression did not change, but she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. He waited for her to continue. "My engagement to Marshall Vale was not a choice," she said, the words a difficult confession. "It was an arrangement made by my father for political influence. I came here believing I could make a life, do some good, but I know what he is. I have seen the way he looks at people, the way he looked at you. He deals with men like Greeley. I do not know how, but I know it is true. To him, I am just a thing to be owned, a piece of his ambition." She took a deep breath. "Last night, you saved more than my life. You saved me from him. I will not go back." The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers, but in the small, dusty cabin, a new flame had been lit. It was fierce and dangerous, and it would not be easily extinguished. They were no longer rescuer and victim. They were allies, fugitives from a corrupt law, and their shared path now led not back toward the false safety of civilization, but deeper into the heart of the wild, uncertain territory. The decision, once spoken aloud in the quiet of the morning, settled between them not with the weight of a burden, but with the solid, grounding force of truth. They were no longer two separate lives thrown together by chance, but a single purpose moving against a current of deceit. The small, dusty cabin became their sanctuary and their war room. The world outside was a threat, but within these four log walls, a fragile but powerful alliance was forged. Ash laid the folded, soot-stained page from the ledger on the rough plank table between them. He pointed to the names and the lists of supplies. "This is the truth of San Miguel," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Greeley does not just steal these things. They are given to him. Dynamite, fuses, cartridges." Evelyn leaned forward, her brow furrowed in concentration. She recognized the name of the merchant, a portly, self-important man who had been the first to shake Thomas's hand at the disastrous festival. "Mr. Abernathy," she breathed. "He is on the town council. He spoke at length about the need for expansion, for a new aqueduct to bring more water down from the high country." The pieces began to slide into place, the ugly picture clarifying in the morning light. It was a puzzle made of greed and ambition. "Greeley and his men create the danger," Ash reasoned, his finger tracing a line in the dust on the table. "They attack homesteaders, wagons, the dine. People become afraid. They sell their land for nothing or abandon it altogether." "And men like Abernathy buy it," Evelyn continued, her voice sharp with dawning comprehension. "They buy the land and the water rights for pennies. The dynamite is not for robbing banks. It is for blasting a new channel for the river, a private channel that would make their new lands valuable and leave the small ranchers and your people with dry creek beds." It was a conspiracy born of the territory's greatest thirst not for gold, but for water. Water was life, and control over it was the ultimate power. And in the center of the web sat the man who promised to restore order. "Thomas," Evelyn whispered, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. "He is the other side of the coin. Greeley creates the chaos, and Thomas rides in to be the hero who contains it. Every raid makes the townspeople more desperate for a strong hand, for a man who is not afraid to be ruthless. They would give him any power he asked for, make him a territorial governor, perhaps, if he could guarantee their safety and their profits." Her kidnapping was the masterstroke. It was not a crime of passion or opportunity. It was a calculated move to make the conflict personal, to give the ambitious Marshal a noble crusade that would cement his power and send any real lawmen chasing shadows in the wrong direction. Ash nodded slowly. "He gains power. Abernathy gains land. Greeley gets his silver and a blind eye from the law. Everyone profits. Everyone except the people who lived on the land, the people whose lives were being casually destroyed to serve the ambitions of a few powerful men. For the first time since her capture, Evelyn felt a surge not of fear, but of cold, clear anger. Her ideals about bringing education and enlightenment to the frontier felt like a child's fantasy. The real lesson of this land was about power and the brutal lengths men would go to seize it. A new equality settled between them. Ash had the skills of the hunter, the knowledge of the land. Evelyn possessed a sharp, analytical mind, an ability to see the patterns of corruption that underpinned the violence. They were two halves of a whole, and together, they were formidable. The day passed in quiet planning. They had to assume that Vale, upon discovering their deception, would send riders looking for them. The cabin was no longer safe. They needed to move, but not without a plan. "I cannot fight them alone," Ash said, his gaze fixed on the distant mesas visible through the open doorway. "And you cannot either. Vale has his posse. Greeley has his gang. We need help." "Who would help us?" Evelyn asked, the question heavy with the reality of their situation. "The town believes I am a victim, and you are, at best, a hired hand. They would never believe the truth about their own marshal." "Not them," Ash said. "My people." He paused, the decision weighing on him. To involve the Dine was to risk bringing the white man's war to their doorstep. But the threat was already there, hidden in the whispers of a new aqueduct that would bleed their ancestral lands dry. This was their fight, too, whether they knew it yet. "I must send a message." He found a smooth, flat piece of shale and, using the charred tip of a stick from the fire, he drew a series of symbols. It was not a letter in her sense of the word, but a map and a plea, drawn in a language of pictures and signs that his people would understand. It showed the river, the location of the abandoned ranch, and the symbol for danger. He added the sign for a council, and the sign for a stolen spring. He wrapped the stone in the crimson silk scarf Evelyn had left behind in the canyon, a splash of color that would be recognized. "My cousin, Adani," he explained. "Her camp is a day's ride from here. I will find a shepherd boy, someone who can move without being seen, and send him with this. The message is not a call to war. It asks the elders to send men, not as fighters, but as observers, to witness what is happening to the water. It asks them to be ready to offer shelter to those who might be displaced. It is a call for protection, not attack." As the afternoon sun began to dip, casting long shadows from the cabin, Ash went outside to scout the area, to ensure they were still alone. He moved to the edge of the clearing, his body blending into the tree line. Evelyn watched from the doorway, a knot of anxiety tightening in her chest. The crack of the rifle was a sudden, violent sound that shattered the afternoon peace. Ash dove to the ground, rolling behind the trunk of a fallen pine tree an instant before a second bullet kicked up a spray of dirt where he had been standing. 2 riders, scouts from Greeley's gang, had circled back to check the trail. They were positioned on the ridge overlooking the cabin, their rifles resting on the rocks. Evelyn's heart leaped into her throat. She ducked back inside the cabin, her mind racing. They were pinned down. Ash was exposed. She looked around the small room, her eyes desperately searching for anything that could help. Her gaze fell on the hearth, where a few small embers still glowed. An idea, desperate and dangerous, took hold. "Ash," she called out, her voice low but clear. "The smoke." He understood immediately, while the gunmen on the ridge were focused on the spot where he had disappeared. Evelyn grabbed a handful of damp leaves and pine needles she had gathered for kindling and threw them onto the embers. A thick, acrid smoke began to billow from the small fire and pour out of the cabin's chimney. It was not a signal fire, but a smoke screen, a sudden, inexplicable plume that would draw the shooter's attention. As one of the gunmen shifted his aim toward the cabin, curious about the sudden smoke, Ash moved. He did not run. He scrambled, low to the ground. from the fallen log to a thicket of scrub oak, changing his position, making himself a moving target. A bullet splintered the wood of the log he had just left. Inside the cabin, Evelyn pressed her back against the log wall, her heart pounding. She had done all she could. Now she could only wait. She heard another shot, then another. Then, a sudden, unnerving silence. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The smoke in the cabin thinned. She held her breath, listening. Finally, she heard a soft sound at the door. It was Ash. He slipped inside, his breathing hard, a dark line of blood running down his left arm. A bullet had grazed him, tearing through his sleeve and scoring a shallow but painful line in his flesh. "They are gone," he said, his voice tight with pain. "For now. They were just scouts. They will go back for the others." Evelyn's fear was instantly replaced by a focused calm. "Sit down," she commanded, her tone leaving no room for argument. She took the linen bandage from her own arm, now clean and dry, and tore it into strips. She washed his wound with the last of the boiled water, her touch as gentle and sure as his had been with her. The injury was not deep, but it was bleeding freely. She pressed a clean pad of linen against it and bound it tightly, her hands steady. He watched her, a look of quiet surprise on his face. She was not the frightened woman he had found by the river. She was his partner, his equal, her courage as real and as practical as his own. When she finished, their hands lingered for a moment, her smaller one resting on his bandaged arm. In that touch, a silent oath was sworn. It was a promise made not of words, but of shared risk and mutual care. They would face what was coming not as individuals, but as one. "We have to leave," he said, his gaze meeting hers. "Now, before they return." She nodded, her resolve hardening. The fire in the cabin was nearly out, its warmth and safety a memory. Their love, born in that small, sheltered space, would now have to survive in the open, under the harsh and unforgiving sky of the enemy's country. It would be a love tested not by whispered promises in the dark, but by the shared struggle for justice and survival in the blinding light of day. The journey back to San Miguel was a descent into the lion's den, undertaken not with the bravado of conquerors, but with the quiet, desperate resolve of people who had no other choice. They moved through the territory like ghosts, avoiding the main trails, subsisting on what little jerky they had left and the water from hidden seeps that Ashki Nez knew of. His arm throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, but Evelyn's bandage held firm, a constant, physical reminder of the bond they now shared. Her presence beside him was a source of both strength and a profound, aching vulnerability. To protect her had become as essential as breathing. As they neared the town, they saw the smoke first, not the thick, dark plume of a major fire, but the hazy aggregation of dozens of cook fires and the dust kicked up by a large gathering of men and horses. Something was wrong. The air itself felt tense, coiled like a rattlesnake ready to strike. They left their horses in a hidden arroyo and approached the last few hundred yards on foot, using the sparse cover of creosote bushes and the crumbling adobe walls of an abandoned homestead to mask their approach. From the edge of town, they could see the source of the commotion. The main square was filled with men, not the usual assortment of miners and merchants, but a grim, armed congregation, their faces tight with a mixture of fear and manufactured rage. At the center of it all, standing on the steps of his office so that he was elevated above the crowd, was Marshal Thomas Vale. His voice, amplified by the unnatural silence of the crowd, carried across the square. He was a master performer, his gestures broad and commanding, his tone a carefully modulated instrument of persuasion. He spoke of savagery and betrayal. He told the crowd how he had trusted the Navajo tracker, how he had been led on a fool's errand while the real culprits, other Indians, had used the opportunity to spirit away his beloved fiancée, taking her deeper into the wilderness. He painted a picture of a vast, shadowy conspiracy among the native tribes, a coordinated effort to drive the white settlers from the land. "They seek to terrorize us, to break our spirit," Vale boomed, his voice ringing with false sincerity. "They have taken Miss Hart, an innocent woman, a teacher who came here only to bring the light of knowledge. They have made this a fight for our very survival. I am therefore calling for a territorial posse, a force of arms to ride into that wilderness and bring back not only Miss Hart, but the justice these savages deserve." A roar of approval went up from the crowd, a guttural, ugly sound. Men raised their rifles in the air. The poison of Vale's words had worked its magic, turning their fear into a sharp, focused hatred. He was not just building a posse, he was inciting a war. It was into this cauldron of manufactured fury that Ash and Evelyn walked. They emerged from the alleyway between the mercantile and the assay office, stepping out of the shadows and into the harsh, revealing light of the sun. They did not run or shout. They simply walked, side by side, toward the center of the square. A ripple of confusion went through the crowd. A man in the front row pointed, his mouth agape. The shouting died down, replaced by a wave of stunned, murmuring disbelief. Here was the villain of the marshal's story, the treacherous Navajo, walking calmly into their midst. And beside him, not dragged in chains but moving with a free and determined stride, was the captive herself, Evelyn Hart. Her dress was torn, her arm was bandaged, but her head was held high, her eyes blazing with a cold fire that made the crowd fall back before her. They stopped in the open space before the steps, 100 pairs of eyes fixed upon them. Thomas Vale's speech died in his throat. His face, for a fleeting instant, was a mask of pure shock, the blood draining from it, leaving it a pasty white. He recovered quickly, his actor's instincts taking over, but the initial, genuine surprise had been seen by all. "Evelyn," he cried, his voice thick with feigned relief. "Thank God this savage has released you." He started down the steps, his arms outstretched as if to embrace her. Evelyn held up a hand, a simple gesture that stopped him in his tracks. "I was not released. Marshal Vale," she said, her voice clear and strong, carrying to every corner of the square, "because I was never his captive." The crowd murmured, their certainty beginning to fracture. This was not the reunion they had expected. "My dear, you are overwrought," Vale said, his tone shifting to one of condescending concern. "The ordeal has confused you. This man is a liar, a traitor who led my posse astray." "The only liar standing in this square is you," Evelyn retorted, her voice gaining strength. She took a step forward, a lone woman confronting the most powerful man in town. "This man, Ashki Nez, found me after I escaped from the real kidnappers, the men you secretly work with, the copper vultures." A gasp went through the crowd. The accusation was so monstrous, so direct, that it was impossible to ignore. Vale's face darkened, his mask of concern slipping to reveal the cold fury beneath. "She is hysterical," he shouted to the crowd. "The Indian has filled her head with fantasies. Look at her. She does not know what she is saying." "I know exactly what I am saying," Evelyn declared, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the townsfolk. "I am saying that my engagement to this man was a business arrangement, a political maneuver that I wanted no part of. I am saying that he and Mr. Abernathy and other powerful men have been using Rafe Greeley's gang to terrorize this territory, to drive people from their land so they can steal the water rights for a new aqueduct. My kidnapping was a lie, a piece of theater designed to make him a hero and to give him the excuse he needed to start a war with the Navajo people, whose only crime is living on the land you covet." The truth, stark and brutal, hung in the air. Some men in the crowd looked at each other, their expressions troubled. They had heard the rumors about the aqueduct. They knew the fear that Greeley's gang had spread. Evelyn's words were not fantasy. They were the key that unlocked a dozen smaller, nagging mysteries. Vale saw his power slipping away, his carefully constructed narrative crumbling into dust. He was cornered, exposed, and like any cornered animal, he lashed out, His hand flew to his hip, his pistol clearing the leather in a single, fluid motion. He did not aim at Evelyn. He aimed at the man he blamed for it all. "You," he snarled at Ash, "you have poisoned her mind." But Ash was already moving. He had been watching Vale's hands. His body tensed for this exact moment. He did not draw his own weapon. Instead, as Vale's pistol came up, Ash threw himself to the side, diving behind a heavy wooden horse trough. The marshal's first shot splintered the wood where Ash's head had been a second before, the sound of the gunshot shockingly loud in the tense silence. Vale fired again, the bullet thudding into the side of the trough. Ash, now with his own pistol in hand, did not return fire blindly. He waited. In the panicked screaming and shouting of the crowd, he saw his opening. Vale shifted his stance, momentarily exposing his gun hand. Ash's pistol bucked in his hand. It was not a shot to kill, but a shot of surgical precision. There was a sharp, metallic clang. Vale cried out, a sound of pain and surprise, and his pistol flew from his grasp, clattering onto the dusty ground. He stared at his hand, at the mangled trigger guard of his weapon, and then at Ash, his face a canvas of disbelief and impotent rage. The standoff was over. The lawman had been publicly disarmed by the man he had branded a savage. It was in that moment of stunned silence that the sound of hoofbeats, a thunderous drumming sound, came from the end of the street. A dozen riders, their faces covered with bandanas, burst into the square, their horses plowing through the terrified crowd. They were the Copper Vultures. Rafe Greeley was at their head, a rifle held high. They did not fire on the marshal. They fired into the air at the windows of the buildings, their goal to create chaos and cover. Two of the riders galloped directly toward the steps of the office, their intent clear. They had not come to attack the law. They had come to rescue it. The final, damning piece of evidence had arrived. The sight of the territory's most wanted outlaws riding to the aid of the chief lawman was a truth more powerful than any accusation. The town of San Miguel erupted into a war against itself. Men from Vale's posse, their loyalty absolute, opened fire on Ash. Other townsmen, their eyes finally opened, began shooting at the vultures. The square became a maelstrom of smoke, shouting and ricocheting bullets. Ash pulled Evelyn deeper into the cover of the alleyway as the vultures grabbed a stunned and bleeding Marshal Vale, pulling him onto the back of a horse. The battle for San Miguel had begun. It was no longer a matter of law or lies. It was a brutal, desperate fight for survival. The chaos in the square was a whirlwind of smoke, panicked screams, and the deafening roar of gunfire. Through the maelstrom, Ashki Inez saw the Copper Vultures' close ranks around a stunned Thomas Vale, their movements practiced and efficient. They were not a gang of thugs. They were a disciplined unit, and they were extracting their asset. With a final volley of covering fire, they wheeled their horses and galloped out of town, leaving behind a bewildered and bleeding community. The fighting sputtered and died, replaced by the sounds of groaning men and the low murmur of disbelief. The truth, delivered with the brutal punctuation of bullets, had settled over San Miguel. The blacksmith, a man who had openly scorned Ash just days before, now stood with a smoking rifle in his hand, his face a mask of shame and fury. He looked at Ash, then at Evelyn, who was already tearing strips from her petticoat to create bandages for a wounded shopkeeper. "They are heading for Bluestone Canyon," Ash said, his voice cutting through the dazed quiet. "It is their fortress. We have to go now, before they can prepare a defense." A handful of townsmen, their faces grim with the knowledge of their own foolishness, gathered around him. The blacksmith was the first to speak. "We ride with you." It was not a question. It was a statement of penance. Just then, a dozen riders appeared on the rise overlooking the town. They were Dine, moving with the quiet grace of men who are one with their horses and the land. They had received Ash's message, carried by a shepherd boy in the crimson scarf. They had come not to fight, but to watch over the water, to bear witness. But now, seeing the smoke and the chaos, their leader, an older man with eyes as keen as a hawk's, understood that watching was no longer enough. "The men who steal water also steal lives," the old man said to Ash in their own tongue. "We will ride with you to this Bluestone Canyon." Evelyn finished tying a bandage around the shopkeeper's arm and came to stand beside Ash. "I am coming with you," she said, her voice steady. There was no trace of the terrified woman he had found by the river. Her eyes were clear and resolute. "It is too dangerous," Ash began, but she cut him off. "You have a dozen men who will likely get shot," she countered, her gaze unwavering. "You will need someone to patch them up. I am not a helpless passenger anymore. Ash, this is my fight, too." He looked at her, at the strength that had been forged in the fire of the last few days, and he knew she was right. Their destinies were now a single, braided cord. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The decision was made. A strange and unlikely posse was formed. A small band of Navajo trackers and chastened townsfolk, led by a man without a badge and a woman without a home, riding out to bring a corrupt lawman to justice. Bluestone Canyon was aptly named. Its walls were sheer cliffs of a deep, slate-blue rock, streaked with veins of darker minerals that glittered in the sun. It was a natural fortress, with a narrow, winding entrance that could be easily defended. The trail leading into it was littered with loose scree, making a quiet approach impossible. Nature itself was Greeley's greatest ally. Ash led his small force to a high ridge overlooking the canyon entrance. From there, they could see the outlaws' camp, a collection of rough shelters and a large corral holding their horses. They could see Greeley directing his men, placing sentries on the high rocks. And they could see Thomas Vale, his hand bandaged, pacing like a caged wolf near a campfire, his authority gone, now just a valuable prisoner of his own conspirators. "A direct assault is suicide," the blacksmith muttered, stating the obvious. "We will not attack directly," Ash said. He turned to the old Dine leader and spoke in their language, his hands sketching a map in the air, pointing to ridges and dry washes that were invisible to the white men. A plan was formed, one that relied not on overwhelming force, but on stealth, knowledge, and the element of surprise. The townsmen would create a diversion at the mouth of the canyon, drawing the vultures' attention, while Ash and the Dine trackers would use a treacherous goat trail to climb the canyon wall and come down upon the camp from above. Evelyn watched them go, her heart a tight knot in her chest. She remained with two of the townsmen and the horses, her medical supplies laid out on a clean blanket. She was their anchor, their place of retreat. Her role was just as vital and just as dangerous. The sound of gunfire, when it came, was a sharp, cracking sound that echoed off the canyon walls. The townsmen had begun their diversion, their shots kicking up dust around the sentry posts. As expected, Greeley's men returned fire, their attention fixed on the obvious threat at the canyon's entrance. High above, Ash and his men moved like mountain cats along a narrow, crumbling ledge. The bluestone was slick and treacherous under their moccasins. One misstep meant a fall of 100 feet to the canyon floor. They reached a spot directly above the camp and began their descent, using ropes of plaited leather to rappel down the sheer cliff face. They landed in the camp with the shocking suddenness of a lightning strike. The vultures, their attention focused on the battle at the canyon mouth, were taken completely by surprise. The fight was short, brutal, and intimate. It was a chaotic swirl of close-quarters gunfire, the flash of knives, and the desperate, grunting sounds of men fighting for their lives. The Dine moved with a deadly efficiency, their knowledge of this terrain giving them an almost supernatural advantage. In the midst of the chaos, Thomas Vale saw his chance. He was unarmed, but he was not without resources. He saw Evelyn, who had moved forward with the other townsmen as the battle turned, her attention focused on a wounded man. To Vale, she was the source of his ruin, but she was also his last, desperate gambit. If he could get to her, he could bargain his way out of this disaster. He lunged for her, grabbing her by the arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. "It is over. Evelyn," he snarled, his face a mask of desperation. "You are coming with me." He tried to drag her behind a large boulder, to use her as a human shield. Evelyn reacted on pure instinct, her mind flashing back to the lessons Ash had taught her through his quiet example: balance, leverage, and striking at the point of weakness. She did not try to pull away. Instead, she drove her weight forward, into him, unbalancing him. As his grip momentarily loosened, she brought the heel of her free hand down in a sharp, brutal blow on his wrist, striking the cluster of bones and nerves, just as she had seen Ash do to a stubborn knot in a rope. Vale cried out in pain, his fingers going numb, his grip failing. In that instant, she twisted away, wrenching her arm free. The movement was so unexpected that he stumbled backward. Before he could recover, Ash was there. He moved past Evelyn, a blur of motion, and slammed into Vale, driving him hard against the canyon wall. There was a brief, furious struggle, but Vale was no match for Ash's focused strength. Ash twisted the former marshal's arm behind his back, forcing him to his knees in the dust, a prisoner of the very man he had tried to destroy. Across the camp, the battle was ending. The last of the vultures were either captured or had fled deeper into the canyon, but the greatest danger was yet to come. Rafe Greeley, seeing his empire collapsing around him, had retreated to a small cave carved into the canyon wall. It was his storeroom, his armory. He emerged with a crate under his arm, a wild, cornered look in his eyes. It was the dynamite. "If I cannot have this canyon, no one will," he roared. And he lit the fuse on a stick of dynamite. His plan was clear: to throw it at a weak point in the cliffs above, to bring the entire canyon wall down, burying them all, heroes and villains alike, under a mountain of blue stone. Ash saw him and shouted a warning. While the others scrambled for cover, he ran directly toward Greeley, a desperate, suicidal charge to stop him. Greeley hurled the sputtering stick of dynamite toward a fissure in the rock. Ash leaped, his fingers just managing to catch the stick mid-air. He turned and threw it as far as he could, down the canyon, where it exploded with a deafening roar that shook the very foundations of the earth. But his momentum had carried him too close to the cliff edge. As the ground shuddered from the explosion, the rock beneath his feet gave way. He scrabbled for a handhold, his fingers scraping against the hard stone, but he was sliding, falling over the precipice. Evelyn screamed his name. She did not hesitate. She ran to the nearest horse, a pack animal, and with frantic fingers, unbuckled a long, thick leather strap used to secure the load. She lunged for the cliff edge, the strap held tight in her hands. She saw Ash, hanging by one hand from a gnarled root that jutted out from the cliff face, his other arm hanging uselessly. "Ash, catch it," she screamed, and she threw the end of the strap down to him. It fell just within his reach. He released his precarious hold on the root and grabbed the leather, his full weight now held by Evelyn and the strength of the strap. The strain was immense. The leather cut into her hands. Her feet slid in the loose gravel, pulling her closer to the edge. "I will not let you go," she gritted out, her whole body trembling with the effort. Just as her strength was about to fail, the blacksmith and one of the dine trackers reached her, grabbing the strap, adding their strength to hers. Together, inch by painful inch, they hauled Ash back up from the abyss, over the edge, and onto the solid ground of the canyon floor. He lay there for a moment, breathing heavily, his chest pressed against the earth. Evelyn knelt beside him, her hands shaking, her relief so profound it felt like pain. He rolled over and looked at her, his eyes filled with a depth of emotion that needed no words. The leather strap, a simple, utilitarian object, lay on the ground between them, a symbol of the unbreakable bond that had just saved his life. There was a shout from the others. Rafe Greeley, in the confusion, had tried to climb the scree slope on the far side of the canyon to escape, but the dynamite blast had destabilized the entire wall. With a low, groaning sound, a river of rock and blue stone broke free and came cascading down the slope. Greeley gave a single, terrified cry as the rock slide engulfed him. A fitting end for a man who had tried to master the violence of the land, only to be consumed by it. A profound silence fell over Bluestone Canyon, broken only by the whisper of the wind and the groans of the wounded. The battle was over. Rafe Greeley was gone, and Thomas Vale, the once proud marshal, was a bound and defeated captive, his face a ruin of broken pride. Justice had come to the canyon, not on the word of a lawman, but through the courage of a small, determined group of people who had chosen to trust each other. The return to San Miguel was not a triumphant parade. It was a slow, grim procession that mirrored the weariness in their souls. Ashki Nez and the Dine Trackers led the way, their faces impassive. Behind them came the humbled townsmen, their rifles now held loosely, their expressions a mixture of exhaustion and shame. In their midst were the prisoners, the surviving copper vultures, their bravado gone. And at the very center, Thomas Vale, his hands bound, his face a mask of stone, refusing to meet the eyes of the people he had betrayed. Evelyn rode beside Ash, no longer a captive or a prize to be won, but a quiet, integral part of this new, fragile order. The townspeople emerged from their homes and businesses, not with cheers, but with a stunned silence. They saw their marshal brought back a prisoner, and the sight was a blow to the very foundation of their world. The simple lines of good and evil had been irrevocably blurred, and the community stood in the dust, uncertain of what to believe, until they saw the faces of the blacksmith and the other men who had ridden out. In their grim, exhausted honesty, the town found its truth. There was no courthouse worthy of the name, so the trial, if it could be called that, took place in the open square, under the vast, unforgiving sky. It was a court of dust and public opinion. The mayor, a man whose authority had been hollowed out by recent events, presided from the steps of the mercantile, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly. Thomas Vale and the merchant Abernathy, now also under guard, were made to stand before the assembled community. The proceedings began, not with legal jargon, but with a simple presentation of fact. Ash stepped forward. He did not speak of his own grievances or the marshal's treachery. He simply unfolded the charred, brittle page from the ledger he had found at the abandoned ranch. He held it up for all to see. "This is a record," Ash said, his voice calm and steady, carrying in the silence. "It lists dynamite and fuses and rifle cartridges. It lists payments made. The names on this page are Rafe Greeley and Mr. Abernathy." Abernathy, his face slick with sweat, began to bluster. "It is a forgery, a lie concocted by a savage to stir up trouble. This is madness!" But his protests were cut short by a new voice. An old vaquero named Mateo, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun and time, stepped forward. He had lived his whole life on a small patch of land by the river, a place his family had held for generations. He removed his hat, holding it respectfully in his gnarled hands. "For 2 years, my cattle have been stolen, a few at a time," he said, his voice raspy but clear. "My fences have been cut. Men with their faces covered have told me that this land is no longer safe for my kind. Last month, they burned my barn. They told me to take what I could carry and leave, that a new, important man would be needing the water that crossed my land." He looked from Abernathy's terrified face to Vale's impassive one. I did not know who this important man was. Now, I think I do. Before the murmur from this testimony could die down, another figure emerged from the crowd. It was Mrs. Chen, the woman who ran the small Chinese grocery at the edge of town. She was a small, delicate woman, but she stood before the assembly with an unshakable dignity. Every month, for a year, She began, her voice quiet but carrying a surprising strength. "A man from the copper vultures has come to my store. He did not steal, he took what he wanted, flour and oil and rice, and told me it was the price for my family's safety. He said the marshal was a busy man, that he could not be everywhere at once, and that men like Greeley provided a different kind of order." She paused, her dark eyes finding Abernathy's. "The last time he came, he said that soon there would be many new workers, and that a smart woman would pay for the privilege of selling them supplies. He told me Mr. Abernathy was a man who rewarded his friends." The testimony of the vaquero and the shopkeeper, two people who were usually invisible to the leaders of San Miguel, was a dam breaking. Their quiet words of truth washed away the last of Abernathy's blustering denials and Vale's stoic silence. The town saw, with horrifying clarity, the depth of the conspiracy that had been strangling them. It was then that Evelyn stepped forward. The square fell completely silent. She walked until she stood directly in front of Thomas Vale. She looked at him, not with the hatred he might have expected, but with a profound and sorrowful pity. "The arrangement made by my father is broken," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "The engagement is ended. There is nothing between us now but the truth of what you have done." He flinched, as if she had struck him. It was the first crack in his iron facade, the loss of his power. He could bear with stoicism. The loss of his prize, publicly and absolutely, was the blow that finally brought him low. Evelyn then turned from him and walked to where the old dine leader and his men stood watching, their faces somber. She stopped before them and bowed her head slightly, a gesture of deep and sincere respect. "When I came to this land," she said, her voice now softer, filled with a humility that no one in San Miguel had ever heard from a white woman addressing the dine, "I came with a foolish pride. I thought my ways were the only ways, that my knowledge was the only kind that mattered. I saw your people as something to be taught, to be changed. I was blind. You have a wisdom that comes from the land itself, a strength and a dignity that my world has forgotten. For my ignorance, and for the terrible price you have paid for the greed of men like him." She gestured toward Vale. "I am truly and deeply sorry." The old leader looked at her for a long moment, his ancient eyes reading not just her words, but the truth in her heart. He then gave a slow, deliberate nod of acceptance. It was a small gesture, but in the context of the long, painful history between their peoples, it was monumental. A bridge had been built, not of wood or stone, but of honesty and respect. The shamefaced town council, led by the mayor, convened on the mercantile steps. There was no debate. Thomas Vale, Abernathy, and the captured vultures would be held in the town jail under a guard of trusted citizens until the territorial judge could be summoned. The shadow of their corruption had been banished by the harsh light of day. Then, the mayor did something unprecedented. He formally addressed the dine leader. "The water in the river is life for us all," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of his newfound understanding. "We would like to draw up an agreement, a treaty between the town of San Miguel and the Dine people, to ensure that the water is shared fairly, that its sources are protected, and that no man can ever again use it as a weapon against his neighbor." The old leader agreed, and then the mayor turned to Ash. "We need a man to watch over this agreement," he said. "A man who understands both the ways of the town and the ways of the Dine. A man who walks in both worlds and is trusted in both. We would like to ask you, Ashki Neza, to be the official liaison for this accord. Not a tracker for hire, but a respected officer of this community, tasked with ensuring the peace." Ash looked at the faces of his people, and then at Evelyn's. He saw in her eyes a quiet pride and a deep affection that mirrored his own. He was not being tamed or assimilated. He was being seen, truly seen, for who he was. He gave a single, solemn nod. As he did, a change came over the air. The relentless, brassy glare of the sun softened. A cool breeze whispered down the main street, carrying with it a scent that the territory had not known for months, the clean, earthy smell of rain on dry ground. A single, fat drop of water landed in the dust at Evelyn's feet, creating a small, dark circle. It was followed by another, and then another. A collective sigh of relief went through the crowd as the first rain of the season began to fall. It was a gentle rain, not a violent downpour. It pattered softly on the cracked adobe roofs, darkening the thirsty wood of the sidewalks, and turning the thick red dust of the square into a dark, rich mud. It was a baptism, a washing away of the blood and the lies, a promise of renewal for the fractured, wounded land and its people. In the soft, gray light of the falling rain, there was the quiet glimmer of a new beginning. The first rains of the season gave way to a period of profound and quiet healing. The land, washed clean of its blood-red dust, responded with a surprising blush of green along the creek beds and in the sheltered canyons. The air, once thick with tension and suspicion, seemed lighter, clearer. In San Miguel, the work of rebuilding was not just about the splintered wood and shattered glass, but about mending the fractured trust between neighbors. The trial of Thomas Vale and Abernathy was a swift affair. Their guilt so plain in public that the territorial judge had little to do but pronounce the sentences that would send them to a federal prison for a very long time. But the real change was not happening in the town square. It was happening on a small, sun-drenched patch of land that belonged to neither the town nor the Dine reservation, but rested peacefully in the space between. Here, Ashki, Nez, and Evelyn Hart built their home. It was not a grand house. It was a simple, sturdy cabin of notched pine logs, with a wide porch that faced the rising sun and a stone hearth that formed the warm heart of the structure. The construction was a quiet testament to the new community being forged. The blacksmith from town, his face still etched with the shame of his earlier prejudice, came out on his own time to forge the hinges for the door and the hooks for the hearth, his hammer blows ringing with the rhythm of atonement. Mateo, the old vaquero, helped Ash raise the heavy roof beams, his wiry strength belying his age, and Adani, Ash's cousin, came with other Dine women, showing Evelyn how to mix the rich adobe mud with straw, plastering the gaps between the logs to seal the house against the wind and the cold. They worked together, a small, blended family, their languages mingling in the clear air, their shared labor a prayer for a peaceful future. Before the cabin was even finished, the school had begun. Evelyn started her lessons under the shade of a large cottonwood tree. Her students a motley collection of children who had never before shared a space. There were the pale, freckled children of the white homesteaders, the dark-eyed children of the Mexican families, and the shy, watchful children of the Dine, who at first stood at a distance but were soon drawn in by the gentle gravity of Evelyn's enthusiasm. She did not teach them from the books of Emerson she had brought from Kansas. Instead, she taught them the names of the desert plants in 3 languages. She taught them to count using smooth, painted stones. She taught them the stories of the vaquero, the songs of the Dean, and the history of the town. She was not civilizing them, as she had once so arrogantly dreamed. She was giving them a space to see and understand one another, to build a world where the ignorance that had nearly destroyed their parents could find no purchase. Ash would often stand at a distance, watching her. He saw a strength in her that had nothing to do with surviving hardship, but everything to do with the patient, daily work of creating hope. It was a quiet, formidable power, and his heart swelled with a love that was deeper and more profound than anything he had ever known. One afternoon, as the cabin was nearing completion, they began to move their few possessions inside. Ash had his saddle and rifle, his bedroll, and a few finely woven baskets his mother had made. Evelyn had a small trunk that had survived her journey, containing a few changes of clothes and a handful of books. She reached into the trunk and drew out the thick, woolen blanket he had given her by the river. It was clean now, the scents of mud and fear long since washed away, leaving only the faint, comforting smell of wood smoke. She walked to the main wall of the cabin, the space above the stone hearth. "This should be the first thing we put up," she said, her voice soft. Ash came to stand beside her, a question in his eyes. She did not look at him, her gaze fixed on the rich, dark wool in her hands. "This is the most valuable thing I own," she said. "It is the thing that saved my body and my honor." He reached out and placed his hand over hers, his fingers covering the spot where she held the blanket. He said nothing. No words were needed. The memory of that desperate moment by the river was a sacred, unspoken thing between them, the true foundation upon which their new life was built. Together, they hung the blanket on the wall, its simple, honest texture a centerpiece in their home, a constant reminder of both the darkness they had passed through and the quiet decency that had seen them to the other side. Their life settled into a rhythm dictated by the seasons and the needs of their communities. Ash, as the official liaison, found his days filled with a new kind of work. He was a bridge, a translator of not just words, but of cultures and ways of seeing the world. He mediated disputes over grazing rights with a patience that disarmed the most stubborn of ranchers. He worked with the town council and the den elders to map the springs and ensure the water treaty was honored. His deep knowledge of the land now a formal instrument of peace. He was not a lawman in Vale's mold, a wielder of power and fear. He was a keeper of the balance, a respected guardian of the community's fragile new trust. One evening, as the first chill of autumn was beginning to touch the air, they sat before their hearth. The fire crackled, casting a warm, dancing light on the log walls and the familiar pattern of the blanket hanging above them. Outside, a gentle rain had begun to fall, a soft, percussive sound on the roof of their home. For a long time, they sat in a comfortable silence, a silence born of a deep and settled understanding. "You are a good man, Ashkenaz," Evelyn said quietly, her head resting on his shoulder. He looked down at her, his expression serious in the firelight. "In my world," he said, his voice a low murmur, "a man's worth is measured by his actions, by the promises he keeps to his people and his family. I have tried to be a man worthy of the trust I have been given." "And what of us?" she asked, her gaze meeting his. "What promises do we keep?" He thought for a moment, his hand finding hers, his thumb gently stroking her knuckles. "There is no paper from a judge that can bind two people together," he said. "That is the white man's way. It is a contract, a thing of ownership. Our promise is different. It is not made once. It is made every day. It is the promise I make when I see you with the children and my heart is full. It is the promise you make when you bind my wounds and stand with me against the world. It is the choice we make every morning when the sun rises to walk this path together, as equals, with respect." She leaned into him, her heart filled with a peace so profound it felt like a prayer. This was the freedom she had craved without ever knowing its name. It was not the freedom from hardship, but the freedom to choose, to be seen, to love and be loved for who she truly was. This was the real promise of the West, a beauty found not in the grand, sweeping landscapes, but in the quiet, daily acts of courage and compassion. He tilted her chin up and kissed her. It was a kiss of profound tenderness, a slow, quiet sealing of the promise he had just spoken. It held the memory of the fire in the first cabin, the taste of desperation and hope. But now, it was imbued with the steady, gentle rhythm of the falling rain, with the warmth of the hearth and the security of the home they had built with their own hands. It was the peaceful, certain kiss of a love that had been tested in the crucible of the wilderness and had emerged, not unscathed, but stronger and truer than any force of nature. He drew her closer, and they sat together in the warm, flickering light, listening to the rain. Two worlds, two souls, finally and completely at home. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the red dust and rugged heart of the West. Let us know where you are listening from in the comments below so we can all connect, and please subscribe to my channel Wild West Tales. Like this video, and give it a hype so this story can be shared with more listeners like you.